If you didn't know, Lumix just sent me the S5 Mark IIX to do a review on, and I have that video right here if you haven't watched it already. But in this video, I'm going to be breaking down the Lumix S5 Mark IIX, the prosumer level camera, and the original GH6. Now, I actually own two GH6 cameras, and I've been shooting on Micro Four Third cameras since 2016, and I absolutely love Lumix cameras. Now that I've been using the S5 Mark IIX for the past few months, it's been making me consider if I should switch to the full frame systems. So let's first dive into some of the advantages on the S5 Mark IIX over the GH6. The first advantage is going to be just bokeh. Because it has a full frame sensor, a lot more light comes in and allows to have a lot more bokeh, and your aperture isn't double what it is when shooting on a Micro Four Third camera. The second most obvious feature is autofocus. The phase detect autofocus is absolutely stunning. Here's a couple examples of the GH6 versus the S5 Mark IIX in autofocus. Now, the GH6 isn't bad. It doesn't have terrible autofocus. It's just not great in comparison to this. I just shot an entire soccer spec commercial with this camera on autofocus the entire time, and almost 100% of the shots were locked on the majority of the time, which is really nice when shooting fast-paced stuff. The next feature, which I think is just more of a firmware update in the GH6, is real-time LUT. The advantage of real-time LUT for me personally is not for filming, because I love color grading, I love doing all of that, but it's more or less whenever I'm taking photos with the family, with my wife, just going on trips, throwing in a real-time LUT, being able to just shoot all in JPEG, throw it on my computer, airdrop it to my phone, and be done is really nice for myself. Next feature is just dual SD card slots. It's something that I was missing on the GH6 when they got rid of it, because this allows you to have unlimited recording. Essentially, being able to record on the first SD card, once it fills up, you go to the second SD card, and then you change out the first SD card, and then the second card, once that fills up, you go back to the first SD card. Now, this is more of a little bit of a gripe thing, but I honestly prefer the S5 Mark IIX SD card opening. Being able to just push back and open it is a lot easier than having to push something down and then out on the GH6. The next thing I noticed on this camera is that the focus ring actually shows feet instead of a mountain and a flower. Every time I see the mountain and the flower, I'm just so confused what that even means. It's mostly also really nice when you're doing any detail stuff, and it gives you an idea of how close and how many feet away you can be from something as well. Now, this is a similar design to the original S5 Mark II. The fan system is just built into the camera viewfinder versus being on the back of the camera. This made the camera just a little bit smaller. But if you do actually a side-by-side comparison, something I noticed, and it's probably just because it's a full frame sensor, is it's about the exact same width of the handle at least. The next thing is the open gate on the S5 Mark IIX is actually a little bit wider, shooting in a 3:2 ratio than a 4:3 ratio. You get just a few extra little inches on each side of the bars. This makes it a little bit easier when you're cropping in, filming horizontally. Now, the S5 Mark IIX and the GH6 both can record basically 6K footage, but on the GH6 it records 5.7K in a 17:9 format ratio, and the S5 Mark IIX actually shoots 5.9K instead of 5.7K, and is shooting in a 16:9 ratio. Now again, this could be just a potential firmware update, but the S5 Mark II does support BRAW externally, and I think the GH6 will eventually get that with a firmware update to record externally to a Blackmagic video assist feature. Now, the last feature that the S5 Mark II has over the GH6 is that it shoots 4:3 anamorphic in Apple ProRes. It's a 3.3K, so it's a little bit cropped in, but at least it has a anamorphic Apple ProRes features, since the GH6 actually doesn't, which is kind of funny because it is the Micro Four Third camera. Now that we talked about the full frame advantages, let's talk about some of the advantages for Micro Four Third cameras. So obviously sort of one of the first advantages, which is not a huge advantage really coming up anymore, is going to be the price. I actually ended up buying a second GH6 for only I think $1,300, brand new off B&H or Amazon. But I think it's sort of this gap of the price being the advantage is really closing, so it's not going to be really a pro for much longer. The next thing is that it has a bunch of higher recording quality features. For example, 4K 120 frames a second in 10-bit, or just at 1080 240 frames a second. Now this is obviously a smaller sensor, so it's able to get a lot more features built into that camera, except face detect for some reason, bro. Now the third advantage for the GH6, it's a kind of a debatable advantage, is it has no crop. What I'm meaning is if you hop in 4K 60 frames a second on the S5iiX, it becomes from full frame, it goes to APS-C size sensor or Super 35 look, so it's cropping in on your footage. The reason that this is a debatable advantage is because you throw any lens on and it's a 2x crop as is. So right now I am on the Sigma 16mm, but this is a 32mm equivalent. And I am on f1.4, but in full frame terms, I'm actually on f2.8. Now, these next couple features, I'll kind of speed run right here because they're all physical features on the GH6. The first one is the front record button. I absolutely almost use this 100% of the time because I have my hand, whenever I'm filming, I have my right hand holding the top handle, and being able to press record with my left hand and not having to awkwardly go around is really, really nice, and it speeds up the workflow process. Now the next thing is the GH6 has an extra FN button on the front. I really like having both of my FN buttons be used for electronic stabilization, and then I call it tripod lock or boost IS stabilization. I really like having both of those buttons be on the front. The next physical feature is having just the audio record button being on the top of it. I created a custom button for the S5iiX, but the more physical buttons that are on the camera for specific purposes, the less custom buttons I have to create, the more custom buttons I can use for different purposes. So it's really nice that the GH6 has an audio information button on top of it. My last advantage for the GH6 over the S5iiX is that it doesn't require an SSD for recording Apple ProRes internally. The nice thing is that you can put a CF Express Type B card in this camera, record Apple ProRes without having to use an external SSD recorder, because sometimes if that becomes unplugged, you ruins your shot or anything happens like that. It's not a huge advantage, but it is nice that you are able to just record internally on a CF Express Type B card, just in case if you forgot your SSD by whatever means. Now, it is worth mentioning a couple things that they both have, and they're both very similar to each other. First thing is they both have Apple ProRes internally and also just Apple ProRes RAW output. They both have great dynamic range. I know the GH6 has dynamic range or dynamic boost range mode, basically allowing you to boost your dynamic range. It's sort of like dual native ISO, but not really. And the S5iiX has dual native ISO. For the vlog, it's 640 and 4000, so your image just becomes much cleaner when you boost up the ISO to 4000, and then I typically stay at the 640 whenever recording. Now obviously the last and biggest pro for the Lumix camera specifically, besides all the professional video features that are built in this camera, is the IBIS and stabilization is absolutely amazing. It's literally, it makes me worry about whenever I go to the next level to cinema cameras or shooting on reds and there's no stabilization, and I'm just been so used to the Lumix cameras. So it's a pro for both these cameras, but it's also a con for any filmmakers who get used to these cameras, because the IBIS is just next level. It looks like a gimbal at times, and it's absolutely stunning. Now, I know this video was much longer than most of my other videos, but if you want to learn more about these two cameras, I have a review video on the GH6 right here, and I have a review video on the S5iiX right here. Until next week, guys, peace.